Welcome to the Rockefeller Foundation Breakthrough live stream series highlighting urgent discussions with thought leaders and experts around the world. I'm Sundaa Bridgett-Jones, Managing Director for Policy and Coalitions at the Foundation, and pleased to host this episode of The Breakthrough, where we're exploring questions of technology, whether it is a great equalizer or divider for gender justice and women's empowerment issues. This promises to be an insightful exchange during a time when half of humanity is shouldering more than half of the burden of this pandemic. Too many women have lost jobs, been saddled with additional demands, and traumatized by abuse as COVID-19 spreads across the world. These difficult months have also reminded us, though, that women may give humanity our best chance. We are fighting COVID-19 on the front lines as doctors and nurses, researchers, and caregivers. And so this is a moment to uphold the progress achieved for women and girls since the landmark 1995 Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, even in the face of dire predictions. One is that by next year, 435 million women and girls will be living on less than $1.90 a day as a result of the pandemic. So we'll talk about how technology can reset these predictions to empower women and girls. I am delighted to have a fantastic panel today of three phenomenal women who are leading a charge in the technology space. I'd first like to welcome Esra'a Al Shafei, welcome Alyse Nelson, who is the president and CEO of Vital Voices. I'm so delighted that we can partner particularly on this episode with Vital Voices for this conversation. I'd like to also welcome Esra'a Al Shafei, who is a Bahraini human rights activist with us, a defender of free speech and the founder of Majal.org. And she is represented today by an avatar for her protection. And Virginia Tan, who is the founding partner of Teja Ventures, which is has the first gender lens venture capital firm fund in emerging Asia. And she's also the founder of She Loves Tech. So thank you all for joining us. I'm so excited. And Alyse, I'm going to start with you because I can remember a few years after Beijing Plus 25, meeting you in Istanbul, Turkey. I was working with USAID in Almaty, Kazakhstan, and I had the charge of bringing women from across Central Asia to Istanbul to have a fantastic exchange conversation about women's leadership at that time. And I met you there when you were just starting Vital Voices and putting that together. So I'm so grateful that we have this chance to come together here. You know, your organization and you yourself have been so instrumental in the fight against gender-based violence and the promotion of women's economic empowerment. So could you say more about Vital Voices for our audience today? And I'd love for you also to talk about how technology has advanced the discussion or halted its progress on both of these fronts. So over to you, Alyse.
Thank you, Sunday. Well, I'm thrilled to be here. As you said, Vital Voices was founded on the heels of the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women. So this series, RF Breakthrough, we are thrilled to be part of it and thrilled to partner, of course, with you and all our friends at Rockefeller. And particularly as this new report is released and a partnership between Rockefeller and Georgetown's Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, led by my great mentor and former chair of the board and one of the founders of Vital Voices, Ambassador Milan Revere. So I'm so thrilled to be here to tease out these issues even further. So just to take you back 25 years ago to 1995, the Beijing Fourth World Conference on Women, there are two issues that I think all of us would agree are absolutely central to not only women's progress, but global progress. And those two issues are technology and the ability to be the great equalizer for people around the world. And secondly, the environment. Those are two issues that were not part of the Beijing Platform for Action to improve the lives of women and girls in 12 critical areas. Everything from education to politics to economic development to combating violence against women. But that most progressive document of all time for women and girls did not include technology. Why? Well, 25 years ago, we weren't nearly where we are today. You think about today, we are in a far, far different place. In fact, when Hillary gave that very famous speech in Beijing, where she said that women's rights are human rights, it really was up to women leaders around the world to spread that out to the far flung regions of the globe because social media back then did not exist. And it's amazing, actually, how that speech spread like wildfire in that sort of pre social media era. But I think what's even more fascinating is I was a 21-year-old college student at the time. And the reason that I got on a plane to Beijing to be joined by 55,000 women leaders from around the world was quite frankly because I wanted to know about women's issues. And Google wasn't invented until 1998. And so in 1995, if you wanted to know about women's leadership and what women were doing to make the world a better place, you had to travel somewhere. So obviously, technology has been huge in terms of enabling us to accelerate in terms of connections and understanding. Because I think what technology has enabled in terms of the global women's movement at a very basic level is a common language. So think back 30, 40 years ago, women around the world faced domestic violence, but it was a problem that had no name because we couldn't connect and understand that it was a global problem, a global pandemic. But when we're able to connect, we're able to find those commonalities and name those challenges. So obviously, technology will continue to be quite critical. And I believe it has been the fuel to the fire of the global women's movement. But we also know that it's harming women. We know that women are something like 32 times more likely to experience violence online. We also know that women don't have as much access as men to technology. In South Asia alone, women are 70% less likely to own a smartphone. We also know in countries around the world, every 30 seconds, a woman politician or journalist who uses her voice in social media or via the internet is attacked. Her voice is attacked, and there is very little accountability in this space because cyberbullying is something that is hard to prosecute. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of work to be done. But I would just say, in the words of Malika, who I know is not able to join us, she leads human rights for Google and she does a phenomenal job. The first time I ever met her, she said, the future of human rights will be digital rights because the Death Star is being built and women are not on it. So women need to lead in this space so that we can create a digital and virtual world that puts women and men as equal partners. Thank you, Sunday.
And thanks, Alyse. That was an outstanding way to frame our conversation. And two things I did want to mention. Yes, we are so sorry that Malika Sarasar isn't able to join us, who's leading the human rights work at Google. She felt ill this morning, but we will keep her in mind as we have this conversation and certainly want to engage her for future discussions on this point. And as you so rightly said, and I will come back to this at the end of our segment, we have at the Rockefeller Foundation partnered with the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security on a report called Beijing Plus 25, Accelerating Progress for Women and Girls. And it's an outstanding roadmap for the next 25 years and beyond, thinking about how we can indeed continue to build on the progress that's made and also address some of these issues that we'll be talking about today. And one of the great things, Alyse, that you think you've done is really help to personalize this for us. And I'd love to come to Esra'a to hear a little bit more about your life and professional experiences that have shaped your understanding of gender equality and looking at these issues of technology today. I mean, there's a reason why you are being shown here through the avatar, and would love for you to share with us in our audience about those experiences.
Well, thanks so much for having me. So I had two main interests growing up, technology and politics, specifically as it relates to inclusion and human rights. And both fields were incredibly male dominated, and there wasn't a lot of encouragement for me as a young woman at the time to go into either. So I felt the challenges were tremendous, and there was definitely additional scrutiny applied to women founded nonprofits or tech social enterprises. Even the tedious details were becoming obstacles from banking to obtaining permits, legal paperwork, fundraising, recruiting team members. It's not a coincidence that our team and the teams of many local nonprofits became comprised of all women primarily, and it was because many of us faced the exact same barriers and wanted to collectively overcome them, which we eventually did, to create the projects and platforms that we are now that are now thriving only because of that persistence that we had against incredible odds. So I was really motivated to beat a system that was designed to make me fail. And the reason, of course, I use an avatar is because a lot of the work that I do as a result of that additional scrutiny puts me and my colleagues at incredible risk. Specifically, we work on amplifying underrepresented and marginalized voices, sometimes whose very identities are criminalized. And so privacy and digital security gives me the empowerment that I need to continue this work.
That's terrific, Esra'a. Thank you so much. And we so appreciate you and the leadership that you've done. And I can't wait to hear more about the stories that you have about the work that you're leading. When I met Virginia not too long ago, I heard about her story and really starting up a number she's an entrepreneur. She's a serial entrepreneur and has been doing that kind of work for the past few years, really thinking about ways to provide access to women to financial services, to venture, to capital. And I would just love to hear a little bit more about the kinds of innovative technological solutions that you believe are key to empowering women, particularly economically. Virginia, I think you might be on mute.
For technology.
Okay.
Thank you. Delighted to share more on our experiences with technology, entrepreneurship, and investing. I think there is some good news. The way we see technology is an instrument, essentially. On one hand, leveraging and amplifying women in their roles as what we call market makers or economic drivers, and on the other side, amplifying and accelerating women as conduits of social change. So what exactly do I mean by that? When we invest in companies, and I'll give you quite a few examples, we're looking at technology and business models which can create more income for women, create more economic opportunities for women, for example, access to capital or land, and third of all, provide better or more accessible, more affordable consumer options, in terms of goods and services, for women. And perhaps I can sort of break it down into sort of three different verticals when I think of more income, more economic opportunities, and better consumer options. So on the topic of more income, I think the first thing is, how does digitalization create more work for women? So I think the good news is, I think technology does have its deficiencies, but the good news is that what the data is actually showing us is that in an increasingly digitalized world, especially a post-COVID world, women are actually some of the biggest drivers as well as the biggest beneficiaries of new business models in the internet economy. So let's take work. 870 million women will join the global workforce in the next 10 years. And COVID, I think, has essentially, shown us, accelerated the trend towards remote and contingent work. And I believe women will benefit from this trend simply because we're the ones who've always been traditionally time poor, and also having to balance, work and the pressures of work and life and family. Some of the new, business models we see, in internet economy are, for example, women, through internet platforms being able to be micro entrepreneurs, being resellers, so they're both buyers and sellers in the internet economy, or they're teachers, or their healthcare, or their doctors at home, and through what we call shared economy platforms, enabling them to actually unlock time, which was previously a fixed commodity, to actually earn an additional income from the comforts of their home. We have a company like that called Shiro's, and essentially their main business model, they have 20 million users in India, and essentially what they do is they onboard women as remote workers for companies, and they've been doing a very brisk business here during COVID-19. Let's move towards greater economic opportunities for women. For example, access to capital. Now, what has happened essentially in traditional banking systems is that women are less likely to borrow, or they're less likely to borrow big amounts. So they're more likely to borrow small amounts. They have less access to collateral. They have less credit data. So in traditional banking models, fixed cost structures essentially incentivize lenders to serve clients who lend in bigger amounts. And therefore, they aren't as willing to service smaller unsecured loans. And there's systematic bias in the way credit risk assessment systems are actually established. But the digital revolution, data shows that women are actually more active online. It's a major way they interact with products, brands, and others. So they have more social data. So now, as we move into the era of fintech, first of all, when women have traditionally had less access, to financial services, they're 7% less likely to actually own a bank account. There are, a billion women who are unbanked across the world. Now, fintech actually allows lenders to it brings down the cost of lending, allowing lenders to service any types of amounts, and and using not just credit data, because women have less credit data, but also using social data. So we see fintech, in many cases accelerating access, for women who traditionally didn't, whether through e-wallets, or which substitute savings accounts through their mobile phone. And I think in the third space, if you look at digitalized services, so just take both education and healthcare. 70% of healthcare workers and teachers in the world are actually women. And if you look at digitalized platforms, so just today I was looking at two companies. One is a platform for teachers in India, majority women. I was also looking at one of Pakistan's largest telemedicine platforms, and what was special about them is that they basically were able to unlock the labor of female doctors, because many times in South Asian countries, once you get married, you're actually expected to stay at home. So all these trained doctors actually don't necessarily have work because they're in the home. And at the same time, partnering up with clinics, serving women and girls. So essentially, what digitalization, enables is essentially you unlock demand and supply potentially at scale when previously either you didn't have enough doctors, or you had not enough, or access to healthcare services was essentially too expensive. So you have demand and supply. If you were a teacher, you can earn extra income from the comfort of your home through teaching through a tutoring platform, etc. And when you put education, for example, online, the cost of education also goes down. And in an emerging market country, that means more women actually get the education. So that's how I see technology changing the lives of women, especially economically.
Those are terrific examples, Virginia. Thank you for that. And I know we had a conversation about, whether there's any one technological solution that might work, and there isn't. I think there are several different ways in which we can think about these advancements. I wanted to go back to Esra'a to ask her in particular about how technology can sometimes be used to hamper human rights. I mean, Alyse had referenced what we're seeing in terms of cyberbullying, how violence has really been transformed to online spaces. How can we avert and prevent negative consequences of technological advances? And I'm wondering about the work that you're leading, and admiring the efforts that you're doing, particularly relative to countries that impose high censorship on the use of technology and access. Could you share more, Esra'a?
Sure. So, 16 years ago, when I was first starting out with my human rights work in Bahrain, the internet looked extremely different than it does today. It was actually more promising because at the time, many governments hadn't yet invested heavily in advanced surveillance and censorship tactics. But over time, my platforms started getting more and more censored gradually throughout the region, and of course, other parts of the world. And I knew we had to double down and get creative with how we bypass those obstacles. So this is how Midistunes was born, for example. It's a platform that we founded, a decade ago for independent musicians in the Middle East and North Africa who use music as a tool for social justice advocacy. And when you visit it or when you download the apps, it looks just like a local version of Spotify. But in fact, it's a repository of countless artists who advocate on many issues that they're not really able to openly discuss in their local context without dire consequences. Things like Kurdish rights or the rights of the Baha'i community throughout Muslim majority countries, or women rappers raising awareness about gender equality in Egypt and Iran. So, we had to come to terms with the fact that we will never be able to match the resources of oppressive governments. And so our only weapon is creativity combined with persistence. For example, to discuss the issues of the LGBTQI community in the Arab region, we developed Ahwa, which is a discussion platform that uses gamification techniques to provide support and networking opportunities to a community whose very identity is outlawed. So we think about things like how we combine anonymity with privacy and encryption without compromising on the quality of our engagements. Um, the unfortunate thing is that, of course, there isn't much funding going to these types of initiatives, especially in our region. So we're working under very difficult contexts with very little resources, and yet we're facing these giant censors, who not only want to make the information inaccessible, but also want to punish its creators and participants. So it's a terrifying challenge, but it's a necessary one to confront because we also refuse to give in to the fear and the silence. At the same time, we need to be cautious about how we scale regionally, but also, on an international level, so we can stay relatively under the radar while still having the impact for our work to be truly meaningful.
That's right. I think that's fantastic. And I've just been thinking about how so many of these lessons are ricocheting around the world in terms of how to use technology differently. And Alyse, I'd love for you to share these thoughts, particularly in these times on COVID-19, where the injustices that we've been seeing, not only around the world, but in the United States, the racial and social unrest that we have here relative to that, and how technology is being used to really amplify the voices of these of citizens, essentially, to speak out against some of the marginalization and the isolation and discrimination that's taking place, not only here but and again in other places around the world. Can you speak to that, particularly in these COVID times?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think certainly COVID has fast tracked the way that we think about technology. It is not a nice to have, it is a must have for today and obviously for the future. We've certainly seen that those who don't have technology are being left way behind, whether it be students, whether it be people who are trying to maintain their work. And we also know that women in some of the most marginalized have less than 32%, have a 32% um, less opportunity to get online than men in some of those countries. And we know pretty much throughout the world, women are 12% less likely to have access to technology. So obviously, it can be a huge divide for so many. I think at the same time, one of the things that you talked about is what we've seen is a 30% increase in violence against women. Obviously, when people are inside and quarantined together for long periods of time, we do see an increase in violence in the home and domestic violence. But then you layer on top of that the anxiety that comes with a global health pandemic, and you layer on top of that the loss of jobs, and it's the perfect recipe for particularly violence against women within the home. And we've seen, as I said, a huge spike in not only domestic violence, but also in femicides. And I think there are some really innovative ways that a number of the foundations and partners that we work with are getting at this issue. So, for example, our partners at Avon have this really innovative online cooking show that they put out into Argentina and also into Brazil. But about 5 minutes into the show, they say, please put in your headphones to the women who are watching. And once they put in their headphones, they've been providing information about what do you do if you're a victim of domestic violence in your home. So we are
Mhm.
trying to keep up. I think that people are trying to look at how do we utilize technology to advance and support.
Mhm.
And as you said, certainly when we think about issues, racial justice issues, gender justice issues, certainly technology can be a great organizing tool, as I said before. And I think it enables us, as it did, with Esra'a and Bahrain, and certainly around the Arab Spring, for the world to know what was going on in a particular country or in a particular region, so that the world could be watching, and that hopefully there would be less human rights that would be violated because um, the world was watching. And one of the things that we've seen is that change.org, which I think you all know is the website and the app that enables you to create a petition to hopefully bring about policy change typically. And one of the great statistics is that the majority of petitions are created by women and really fueled by
Mhm.
women's participation. And particularly in this very digital era that we find ourselves in, more so than usual, as we're all confined, or many of us are confined to work from our homes and have school from our homes, there is a rise in a lot of these digital platforms
Mhm.
that are helping people to move for policy change. But it's wonderful to see that even though women have less access to technology around the world, they are the ones that are pushing forward, are using technology to push forward greater change.
Oh, absolutely. And I wanted to, we're having a great conversation amongst ourselves, but I wanted to remind our audience that we are just a few minutes away from taking questions from you. So please do send in the questions that you'd love for this terrific panel to address. Virginia, I wanted to come to you on this question of maybe how can the private sector and governments work together to ensure more equal access to technology, to the kinds of tools that we've just been talking about in the COVID, in this pandemic context, or even beyond. I'm wondering if you have any good examples for us in the work that you've been doing in Asia. Oh, you're on mute again. Yes.
Thank you, Sunday.
Great.
I do have two great examples, actually in our portfolio that I love to share. I think when we talk about technology, technology is not, it's not stagnant. It's not one size fits all. It's dynamic. I think what's really interesting when you talk about equal access to technological tools, what does that actually mean? So, as Alyse, I think rightly pointed out, I think in many parts of the world, people in general don't have smartphones, and perhaps women's even less likely to own a smartphone in certain parts of the world, and also less likely to be able to access the internet. So what does that actually mean? So I wanted to give these two examples. So because I think COVID-19 in many ways has strengthened, our gender lens thesis. We invested in a lot of these companies a year or 2 years before COVID-19, never thinking that this would ever happen. And actually now, the pandemic has actually shown that, these were smart bets. So for example, one of the companies that we invested in does cashless aid distribution, to the unbanked. And, they've been working intensively with the, Indonesian government. Their gross transaction value has gone up 8 times, 20 times actually from quarter one just till now. So essentially what they're doing is that they are distributing aid, in a cashless way, to the beneficiaries, and saving, because they're doing it digitally, saving the government actually tons of money. At the same time, there's increased, accountability, because that aid can only be redeemed at stores for example, staples. So a family or a person in the family can go off and just buy cigarettes or alcohol. So all of it goes to the family. You can account for it, and there's no leakage to corruption. Now, what I find actually very interesting is the fact that this is not done necessarily through apps. this is an app, but it doesn't actually require the unbanked person to have a smartphone, because the unbanked, like you said, don't have smartphones. So what they did is they designed this entire technology solution was designed around the fact that they knew that the top population they were targeting were not likely to use normal, e-wallets or the current fintech apps, because they didn't have smartphones. So essentially, every time they go to a retail store, in their village or in that area, it's facial recognition. So what the merchants do actually is scan their faces, against the ID cards, and all the beneficiaries' ID cards are uploaded to the system beforehand, and then they can actually redeem, the staple foods, and you can distribute much faster than you would have done, physically. So that's an example of technology being designed, what we call, I guess, design thinking, design around the needs versus one size fits all. Another that we have is a company called Frontier Markets, and actually in India. And again, right, because for a long time, venture capitalists did not pay attention to rural commerce. I mean, even companies like Amazon have not been able to conquer last mile delivery in places like India, because even though India has a billion, people who actually live in rural areas. So what essentially they did is, because, again, rural, consumers, they have spend, but essentially they didn't necessarily, have, energy, and they in the past, they didn't necessarily have access to data, or the internet. So how they started off is that they used women. So think of the Avon. So think of exactly Avon women, right? But Avon women armed with digital phones, right? And instead of just selling makeup, they're selling everything. They started selling, their biggest selling thing was, for example, solar torches, because these villages needed energy, but they were not connected to the grid. And then during COVID-19, they've expanded from, to digital banking services, to cattle feed, to FMCG, to sort of phone credit. And how do governments actually, in this case, the government actually gave this last mile, e-commerce and distribution company, in the permits to stay open when everybody else was closed, simply because in times like this, governments need to work with, technology companies like this to ensure that, supply chains remain open, because pandemic or not, people in rural areas, they need to eat more than ever. They need access to banking services when everything else is closed. So these are two, great examples of companies which they've seen, their GMV or their GTV actually go through the roof, post COVID, because this infrastructure was needed in the first place, but often ignored by conventional investors, because these populations
Right.
were seen as, as not necessarily worth it.
Yeah. No, those are great examples, and it also just reminds me of the role that that data play just in various, policy changes. And I'm just thinking about the last 25 years and what kind of data we had, 25 years ago, particularly disaggregated data relative to women, and what we have now. And I continue to think that despite the additional data that we're all collecting, and we've mentioned a few data points today, 1 in 5 women who are victims of domestic violence during this COVID crisis, how 300 million women, fewer women than men, have access to smartphones and technology, et cetera. I'm wondering, as to if you can speak to, um, are we collecting the right data? What additional data do we need to actually advance outcomes for women and girls, or is it not the data that really is going to help to get us there? Or how should we be thinking about that, particularly in terms of making progress for women and girls?
So for me is that the problem is that data isn't necessarily action. So even if we have mountains of data evidencing an issue, if there is no motivation to fix it, we won't move. It takes a lot of grassroots organizing, for example, for our migrant rights platform, where we advocate for the rights of migrant workers throughout the Gulf region, especially domestic workers, many of whom live in deplorable conditions. I mean, the data was alarming, anything from suicide rates to the average number of hours worked per day, or the number of women who weren't getting paid or were being physically and sexually abused. We had tons of data to express the urgency, but it took more than 12 years before we started seeing any noticeable action. And so during those 12 years, it was nonstop grassroots advocacy, mostly online, movement building, translating and disseminating this information across many different channels, countless partnerships, new platforms. I mean, the work is nonstop. So collecting data is just really one step of an otherwise grueling process, a critical step for sure, but not the beginning and the end of the long-term effort.
Oh, I agreed. Let's turn our attention then to the questions that are coming in from the audience. And I'd like to encourage more since we have some time. But one that I'd like to read off that has come in from Santi Sharf in the United States is this. Let me read it. Um, to what extent has the use of technology during COVID-19 advanced the sentiment that the issues affecting women and girls are global and interconnected? And I'm wondering, Alyse, if you could say more about that. So the sense at the moment that, given the situation in which we're all in, how much is technology really further connecting us during this time?
I think absolutely. And I think for an organization like Vital Voices that was founded, in the pre-social media, really pre-technology era, it has really made us think very hard about the way in which we operate, the way in which we connect women leaders, and quite frankly, how much resources we will spend on technology. And we're shifting a lot of the resources that we might have previously used to connect in person and use travel, and really shifting that to spending more time on our technology infrastructure to connect women that way. And I think that's just vitally important in this period of time. So I absolutely agree. If we can find a small silver lining in this current situation, it is enabling us all to understand the power of technology to connect and divide. And thus, we need to put more resources towards it. The other thing that I spend a lot of time, quite frankly, thinking about is AI and how
Mhm.
AI is primarily built by men, and in the early days of AI, we saw that in terms of the fact that all virtual assistants had female voices. Now it's starting to change, but in the beginning,
Mhm.
that's the way it was. And then you had all of these sort of brilliant voices of the Watsons and others who could win Jeopardy, were the voices of men. And that obviously, why did that happen? Because the majority of people who were building these systems were men in rooms by themselves with not a lot of women there, enough at least to make a critical impact. And so as we think about, as I think we're all sort of in a deeper thinking mode right now with this pandemic, and obviously with racial justice and issues of racial justice, of climate change, with the West burning, of gender justice. These things are in the spotlight, and we need to look at how it's not just about being connected, but also about getting women into leadership positions in these places that are creating the future of automation, and quite frankly, the future of the way in which we all connect.
No, totally agreed. And I love to commend our listeners to the work of Algorithmic Justice. They've been doing a fantastic job of thinking about getting more women being a part of AI. And there are other organizations like that as well. Thanks for that, Alyse. So the next question is from Jennifer Williams Salifu, also in the US. And she asks this. Using technology is an awesome opportunity to close the gender divide. Will there be or is there a focus on simple pieces of technology needed in countries where women are not even able to plow the land? She asks. She goes on to say, using technology, the word technology, seems to put the cart before the horse when we still have women missing school because they start their cycle or have to fetch water for the day. So in the US, it's not much different when little girls, like many children or adults, have to sit at the Taco Bell to get access to the internet. So I find this to be an interesting one, Esra, and a challenging one too. Will there be, or is there a focus on the simple pieces of technology needed in countries where women are not even able to plow the land? And in many ways, I know you spoke to this already, but would love to get your response for Jennifer.
Yes, for sure. So in many countries, the digital divide is slowly but surely declining. So this was especially true across the Arab world, as the internet becomes more accessible, both in terms of infrastructure growth, but also affordability to the public in the form of mobile phones, and also as functionality becomes more mobile friendly. Many of these women are able or will become able to obtain resources online that were otherwise out of reach. So, and for me, doubling down on technology that is open and accessible to encourage engagements from communities that have, for the longest time, been left out of the equation, where most of the platforms, aren't designed for their voices. They're not in their language. They're not responsive to the types of devices that they have. And so instead of just using or settling for what's available to us, we also have to be creators using the limitless impact of the web rather than just consumers or users. And I think doing this will enable us to reclaim the narrative in a meaningful way, to triple our overall impact across various issues, and bringing the many voices that are still missing from the table into our platforms as we build them, to make them more inclusive for these types of communities that may not be there yet, but are definitely slowly getting there.
Well, that's great. A question from Kenya.
I'd love to.
Oh, please. Elise, would you like to jump in before I go to the next
Sorry.
question? No, go.
Yeah, I'd love to. I wanted to share with you one of the extraordinary young women we work with, a woman named Faith Flores, who's from the Central Valley of California. And as we've all watched the fires in California, with temperatures heating up with climate change, she's an incredible young woman who grew up with the story of her grandmother working in the on a farm, and obviously temperatures getting well above 100, extremely dry, and her great grandmother actually died of heat stroke. And growing up with that story in her head but never knowing exactly how to solve the issue, when she began to learn about technology, she began to see that technology could be this incredible tool, because with in farms in that region of California, everyone who works on the farm has a smartphone, and the smartphone connects them to the person who tells them which crops need which attention. But she created this app, which we helped her fundraise for and develop. And that app basically, it's called Calor, and what it does is it provides those who work on a farm, um, it provides them with the information about how hot is it? Is it too hot to work? How much do you need to drink? It provides them with their rights, so that they can understand those labor rights. So what I love about her story is that you can imagine growing up with this story about your great grandmother, and then realizing that she could solve that issue to make sure it didn't happen to others in the future, very simply through technology.
That's a terrific story, Elise. Thank you so much. It just shows the power of innovation over time, and actually connects to this question and coming in from Kenya, from Mary Kavulu, who asks, how will women at the grassroots level who cannot afford access to internet or email know about the information that we've talked about here, or any piece of information about the advances that we've been discussing and the work of the women's movement around the world, particularly in the technology space? Which means will we use to reach majority women? And I can share that as well. But Virginia, first, would love to get your thoughts, especially in parts of Asia where you're working, where you're seeing so many innovations come up to help to reach women, who, even those who may not have a smartphone, but still have the ability to be able to to make these connections. So, Virginia?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I mean, I think, I'd be lying if I said that, okay, immediately we're going to solve, all issues relating to access and which a lot of times is linked to cost. But I mean, in my part of the world, whether you're looking at South Asia or you're looking at Southeast Asia, I think has, some of the most engaged mobile users in the world. And I think like China and Africa, unlike the West, I think we skipped the whole PC era and went straight to mobile first because phones in general became so cheap here. And I think what we've seen actually in South Asia, in particular India, is literally the digital revolution the last 5 years or so. Where I think the numbers of Indians reaching the internet have, I think, gone up by like 10, 20 times simply because of the proliferation of cheap data, brought on by Geo, the telco company. So Indians for the first time were able to be able to access the internet almost for free because Geo was building up market share. So we had those dynamics in our favor. But I think, just using the simple example of frontier markets, which I said just now, is that I think when we think of technology, it's not a one size fits all. It's not that everybody just has their own super advanced smartphone and then, they can access the internet through that and then all problems are solved. I don't think it's like that. Sometimes I think, especially when you're thinking of underserved or rural contexts, like I think what Mary was saying, sometimes it's an online offline integration. It's online infrastructure with some offline, distribution. So, for example, in the frontier markets, example, because a lot of the consumers, the rural consumers in the beginning did not necessarily have smartphones. So, the rural women in these villages were essentially deployed. They were essentially the order takers. They were essentially selling, but they were also they were collecting cash and they were also the fulfillment, mechanism. So you were bringing essentially the internet to them. Now, because each woman has a smartphone, which she didn't have maybe like a year ago, she also has that catalog, which consumers can choose from. So and for example, we're starting to see some really interesting trends in ed tech, education technology, and in I think South Asia and in South Asia, and I think accelerated by COVID-19 because a lot of children actually can't go to school, and they may not necessarily have laptops at home, but I think what we're seeing is not just, if you think about traditional ed tech, it's like each child has their own computer and then they access these cool games or tutorials or, private tutoring online. But actually, some like a company we just invested into, for example, what they're doing is doing, B2B sort of mass, STEM technology. And they don't even require, because most of Southeast Asia doesn't have enough qualified STEM teachers, for example. So they don't even really require the teacher to do anything, just facilitate the class, and a group of students can crowd around, one and actually watch the video. So I mean, we need to think of solutions which can actually provide, this access at scale and at a cheaper cost, understanding the physical limitations of our infrastructure. And the fact that not all of us are urban wealthy consumers. So, and that I think is the beauty of technology, is that it is dynamic. It can be designed
Yeah.
around needs. It's not fits all.
I have a former colleague, Kippy Joseph, who led our innovation work at the Rockefeller Foundation. And she would always talk about innovation, but focus not on technology, which is what most people think of when they think of innovation, but of the kinds of processes that we have used for years, our social networks, these groups that we have in communities, our schools and other ways of getting information to be able to really deliver some of this new information to people where they may not necessarily be connected to the smartphone. So I think of that a lot. We have a couple more questions coming in. One from Bangladesh that I'd love to pose to Alyse. It's from Dr. Anisur Rahman. The question is, can you speak about special global initiatives for women to develop their skills to meet the demand of the future and access new employment opportunities in the post-19 economy?
Well, I would certainly say to get connected to Vital Voices and the things that we are doing. As I mentioned before, we've been searching the world for the last 23 years for women who have a vision for change in their countries and communities. And what we have typically done in the past is supported them through training, usually in person, but some online, provided them with a network of their peers, because we know that peer networks help women to take bigger and bolder risks for greater leadership position, with mentoring, with sometimes financial support, visibility, and greater credibility for their work. We offer a number of different training programs. One of our training programs that's currently accepting applications, and it's completely online, is called VV Grow, and it's for women entrepreneurs. So I encourage you to go to our website and find that application and apply. But I think in the future, we will be doing far more training also just purely online, so that we can reach more women leaders, because we recognize that this is the wave of the future, and we need to find ways that we can connect safely and authentically online the way that we do in person. I mean, we all know nothing replaces being together in person, but we need to come pretty darn close. And we are thrilled to have Esra'a really helping advise us in developing what does that platform, that community look like in the future, that is providing women with training and a safe networking space, as she's done across the Middle East. But then also, how do we engage more? How do we use that platform to, ignite policy change, and to bring voices together and to share news? One of the things that I think all of us would agree is that representation matters. We are never going to achieve the goals of the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women without more women in positions of leadership. And what we know is that if you look, either online media or regular media, women represent only 10% of the stories in the media. And only 4% of those, which is a tiny little percentage of the overall media, is media that defines gender stereotypes. And so I think, in this world that is becoming increasingly more digital, we have to become digital natives. And believe me, that is advice for myself as well. I am not a
Yes.
millennial, and I'm not a Gen Zer. So I have a long way to go as well. And I'm lucky to have women like Esra'a and women like Joy, as you mentioned before, Amira Yayawi, a lot of women in our network who are great pioneers in this space and have been great mentors to me on my journey.
Indeed, Alyse, indeed. I wanted to ask Esra'a to speak to this question that's come in from Liberia, because I think it touches on a little bit of what Alyse was saying in terms of your work, Esra'a, in the Middle East. And it's about the importance of social and emotional mental health as we're thinking about, supporting ways to reduce the gender gap. So the question reads, how can social, emotional, and mental health and access to mental health support the reduction of this gender gap that we're talking about today?
Yeah, that's definitely a very important theme. And for me, I think, access is key, but it's not easily obtainable, because in many societies, it's not really a part of our culture to have things like therapy or group support. And even if you do, there is so much we can't talk about openly because of fear, because of censorship, because of policies that are sexist or violently homophobic. And for this reason, online platforms have a major role to play, to serve in providing these types of support without prejudice and judgment, and especially to the many women in our communities who lack these services due to not having the space or opportunities to seek that out. And this is especially true for LGBTQ communities. So at our organization, every single platform that we have is community driven, with support and access to a network as a core vision for everything that we do.
Thank you, Esra'a. And I think we're close to our time together. We have other questions, but I want to be able to answer or ask this one that's come in from Switzerland, which I think is a really interesting question as we talk about it, and love to get your thoughts. And this is maybe to each of you, and just a very brief response. And the question from Luciana Vasquez from Switzerland reads, have you thought about the white savior paradigm that may arise from this discussion on technology and gender equality? So, Virginia, let me start with you first, and then we can move on.
This is an interesting question, especially because I'm based in Asia, so perhaps it's a little less relevant, for us because in Asia, I guess we are the majority. This is what I believe. When I invest in technology, I don't believe in taking technology from the West and then implanting it in the East or any of Southeast Asia, South Asia, or China. So I don't really, I guess, I don't really see a white savior paradigm at all because we're looking at local founders who are creating tech driven local solutions for based on their population's needs. So essentially, what I love doing is actually championing entrepreneurs, great entrepreneurs in each of these countries, who are building technology for towards promoting the rights of women and girls. So I don't necessarily think that in Asia this really applies to us that much. I really believe in local solutions for local solutions for local problems.
Yes, great. Esra?
Yeah, I mean, with technology, more specifically civic tech and the nonprofit world, we have the major issue of people parachuting technology to global communities from a white perspective without understanding the risks, the culture, the political and social implications or context. And as such, these technologies either become dangerous or irrelevant, and they're also often the only ones that get support. Because if we see the major players in tech today, although the users overall aren't primarily white, the founders, the funders, and the main decision makers are. And this is applied across the board, even in the nonprofit world. So we are confined to their narrow, one size fits all approach, which is never designed for women like us. Or for underrepresented voices. Often, any conversations around technology are usually filtered through a white lens. For example, if you look at, Netflix's recent trending documentary, The Social Dilemma, it features primarily white men who actually benefited heavily from the system and appear to encourage the assumption that only white men like themselves also have the solution to the problem that they actually contributed to, ignoring the decades of efforts, often by women of color, who have been sounding off the alarm on the issues of how this technology applies to women, marginalized communities, and especially those who reside in censorship ridden and repressive societies. So, women and especially women of color are often the ones doing most of the work on this issue but getting the least amount of resources because many private foundations sadly do still have a white superiority complex where your work is only meaningful, impactful, or relevant if it's led by a white man or if it's endorsed by a white man, because many are under the impression that white men are the only subject matter experts in this field that are worth listening to. And so a big part of my life's work is challenging this deeply harmful false narrative.
Mm-hmm. It's terrific. And Alyse, what do you say?
Yeah, I will say I think this is something at Vital Voices that we fight very much against. We are big believers that when you go into countries and communities around the world, you must find the leaders who are working locally, as Virginia said, and really invest in them and their vision for change. You can only change what you know. You cannot change the things you don't know and you don't understand. And so we are always working to put the spotlight on them. And I just want to share, I know we're almost out of time, so I want to share. We just released this book, Vital Voices 100 Women Using Their Power to Empower. And in it, one of the women featured, and I just want to read you a small piece about what she said. This is Joy Ulamwini, who you talked about earlier, Sunday. She's a phenomenal woman who created the organization, the Algorithmic Justice League. And let me read to you what she says in this. In this book, we have portraits of 100 different women from around the world, including Esra. Virginia, I would have included you if I knew you. You deserve to be in this book, as does Sunday, because you're all using your power to empower. But each of them have a first person narrative, so their own words. And this is what she says: the progress we made for civil rights, women's rights, disability rights, so many people put themselves on the line so that there can be a more equal society. And it's still a work in progress. If we do nothing, all the progress we've made can be erased under the guise of machine neutrality. And to me, these are sort of important words to live by, because we may think, well, we've moved the needle so far. But I think as we've seen in this era of this pandemic, things can move back very easily. You know, as we've seen with political
Absolutely.
systems around the world, things can move back. And I think if we don't get enough women's voices and women's brains and women's experiences into the space of not just accessing technology, but leading and defining technology and how we utilize it and how it shows up in our lives, you know, we will never tap the full potential of all people. And in fact, we will move backwards. So here's to moving forwards.
Absolutely, Alyse. Yes, beautifully said and wonderful words from Joy. And I want to thank each of you for joining us today. There's so many other questions that have come in. And for those who've sent those in, we try to answer those on our social media platforms. I also wanted just to commend again Elisa's book, the new book from Vital Voices, but also the Beijing Plus 25 report on accelerating progress for girls. It is a roadmap for thinking about these issues ahead. To our audience, thank you for joining us for this very important conversation. I'm reminded of the words of Martin Luther King and also John Lewis and others of the urgency is now. We need to be focused on these issues now. And with voices like the ones we have today, I think that the gender justice movement will be in good hands. So thank you and stay safe and well.